Welcome, everyone. As you can see here up on the screen, we had creating the culturally competent company, which sounded like a mouthful to say. And given the circumstances in my country at this very moment, I was about to actually think of talking about the culturally competent country and how do we make that happen. But I think we'll stick to the topic here at hand, which is making the culturally competent organization. And as some of you may know, for the last almost 30 years, I've been involved in developing cultural competency, both for the end user, the expats, the families that are being relocated from one location to another, as well as creating the culturally competent company, the organization that needs to be working in these other areas outside of their home country. So today, I'd like to explore what makes a culturally competent company, an organization, as well as what makes the individuals in that organization culturally competent. We have to go through 3 steps, in fact. We have to become aware of the fact that cultural competency is on the table. It is an issue in the 21st century world. There is no room for cultural ignorance anymore. In the 21st century, we have to manage cultural differences. So there's this first stage of awareness. The second stage is understanding why these differences exist. What is it about Spain that makes for a more conceptual orientation? What is it about the UK that makes for an end result orientation? And when we understand the reasons for these differences, we can go on to the third stage. And the third stage is, what do I do about it? What kind of strategies can I put in place to manage these differences? The good news is that there are best practices that we've come up with, that we've created, that others have researched, that enable us to bridge these differences in very effective ways. The bad news is that if you go about it looking to change the other, it will be a long and hard slog. So it's not about changing them or the other, but rather it is about managing your response to these very objective, factual differences in culture that are now on the table that need to be managed. And that process is effective cultural competency development. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that and how do we get through that process. When we talk about culture, of course, we like to begin by taking a look at this quote, which takes us back. This is not a new idea of developing cultural competency. The ancient Chinese, 2,500 years ago, understood the critical competency skill required when working with people of other cultures. This is a quote from the Liga, one of Confucius' 5 great classic works, who reminds us that when we enter another region and work with people who are different from ourselves, we must manage these differences successfully. Now, in today's global world, it's not so simple as 2,500 years ago. Most individuals today working in a particular location are actually working on global teams. So if Mr. and Mrs. Smith are relocated from London to Shanghai, not only do they have to understand how to live and work in a Chinese environment, not only must they understand how to work with the Chinese associates that they are working with on a daily basis, but they also must understand what it means to work with people from 25 other nationalities every day, because they're probably working on global teams. This is the nature of the world today. And so we have to train people to the development of a global mindset, to be culturally agile, in addition to understanding the facts that exist between themselves and, in the example I just gave, China. So what makes a global company? How do we define it? What does this beast look like, right? Well, in general, I'd like to summarize it with 3 statements. It's a company where headquarters sets the global strategies that are based on local best practices everywhere. That's the role of headquarters, to establish the best practices that are then going to be put into place everywhere. Second, where headquarters brokers these best practices to the rest of the organization everywhere, so that everyone learns what these best practices are. And where continuous support is given after this process is in place, so that everyone can hone these skills and become very, very good at them. Now, let's illustrate this a little bit. Someone once said that a global company really, fundamentally, is a local company everywhere. The ability to be local and yet achieve the headquarters global strategy. Global strategy, with local tactics. Now, when an organization first starts out on this journey, let's say we've been a domestic company and now we want to work internationally, usually the first step, the intuitive step, is to do what we do best here over there. And that usually marks the beginning of an international perspective, not a global perspective, but an international perspective. Let's export the way we do it here, because we know very well what works here. Let's do the same thing over there. But very quickly we discover that the way we do it here needs to be adapted to the local realities over there. And so that takes us to this next step of acknowledging local differences. So headquarters' responsibilities and tasks is really to take these global strategies. The strategy is the same everywhere. We want to achieve globally X, Y, Z. But how do we do it? We have to do it according to local requirements. And the third step, and I would say this is the development going from an international company to a global company to a transnational company. This third step is getting feedback from all of the locations everywhere around the world, and headquarters brokering this information about how to do things successfully, differently everywhere, and brokering this information throughout the entire organization so that everyone learns these best practices. In fact, headquarters becomes informed of these best practices. So the way we do it in London has to be done a little differently when we go to Kuwait. The strategy can be the same, but the way we achieve that goal in Kuwait has to be a little bit different. And maybe that the way that we do things in Kuwait isn't so bad. Maybe we can learn from that. Maybe there are parts of the global organization that can actually benefit from knowing how they succeed in Kuwait in achieving global headquarters goals. So let's broker this information. Let's get everybody up to speed on the best practices everywhere. And I guess the rhetorical question that I throw out to you folks is, are you working for a company that does this? Does your company share the best practices of all of its parts with all of its parts? That's the role of headquarters in a transnational organization. And headquarters kind of almost becomes invisible in this role, because they themselves are being informed of these best practices and changing their global strategy accordingly. Now, when we looked at culture traditionally, we often used a model of thinking about culture referred to as a cultural iceberg. I remember one time I was speaking about culture in Quito, Ecuador, and I said, think about culture as an iceberg. I'm talking to people who live on the equator, right? Not a relevant metaphor for them. But for our purposes today, so even models of culture, of course, are culturally determined. But for our purposes today, it's a good model to think about the differences and where we need to put our focus when we talk about culture. Like an iceberg, most of culture is invisible. 10% is the visible part. That's the part that we see. That's the explicit culture at the top. But the part that's invisible is underneath the surface. This is 90% of culture. Implicit culture, the part that you do not see, the values and the traditions of a people and the culture. When we work with each other, we're usually only observing the behaviors, not necessarily understanding the values. So oftentimes I get questions like, well, I'm making a trip and when I greet people, what do I do? Do I bow? Do I pick up chopsticks? Do I give them 3 kisses or 2 kisses or no kiss? And the answer is quite simple. You're looking at the tip of the iceberg, the explicit culture. Managing explicit cultural differences is easy. All you have to do is mirror what you see. The hard part is what you don't see. That's the 90% of the cultural values and traditions that have to be explained in order to be understood and managed. And like the Titanic when it was sailing around the global seas, what will sink your ship when you work around these global icebergs is what you do not see. An example of the result of this post-global world that I'm speaking of, where the global forces represented by the sun are melting all the icebergs. Everybody here work with Singalandu? You know the culture of Singalandu? I'm sure you're working with Singalandu or Telemum or Panasau. Singalandu, Singapore, London, and Dubai. That culture has more in common with itself and the individuals in that culture in Singapore, London, and Dubai than it has with the country in which those three areas emerged. In other words, London today, as we all know, in fact, has far more in common with Singapore and Dubai in terms of business styles than it has with much of the rest of the country. We have the development and the phenomenon of these global islands in a post-global world, where the skills are more similar between its parts than they are within the countries in which it developed. So in Dubai, it's far more familiar to work in a Singaporean and London way than it is to work in an Arab Peninsula way. And this fundamental development, this phenomenon of the development of global islands, is also matched with this phenomenon of synchronicity, meaning that due to the melting of the icebergs from these global forces, the tips of all the icebergs are kind of looking the same. When the sun shines on an iceberg, it's the top part that melts first. The bottom part stays frozen. So you travel around the world and you get off the plane in Tokyo and in London and in Johannesburg and in Sao Paulo, and it all kind of looks the same in the workplace. We're all in our big air-conditioned offices. We're all kind of dressing alike. We're all using a form of global English. We're all using technology. But what is similar, what has become homogenized, is the tip of the iceberg, the visible part of culture, the easy part. Those global forces haven't changed the fundamental differences, and those fundamental differences at the bottom are what will get you in trouble. As we say, working around the world from a home-based perspective is international. But working around the world from a world-based perspective is global. And all organizations today need to have that global perspective in order to succeed in the 21st century. Cultural differences are, in fact, tools for doing just that. And that's why we must develop cultural competency in the individuals and in the organizations in which we work. Thank you all very much for your time today. I hope it was useful for you.